Topic 1. What is sexual violence? This training module deals with the topic of sexual violence and abuse. Even for professionals, this topic can be upsetting. It is important that we look after ourselves. However, we need to honour and park any personal feelings and experiences. If we become too distressed, we may not be able to appropriately focus on the people we are supposed to help. It is important that we seek support for ourselves when needed in order to avoid vicarious trauma, especially if personal memories are triggered. Topic 1 is concerned with sexual violence against people with intellectual disability. However, it is important to note that alongside the right to protection from sexual violence, people with intellectual disability have a human right to sexual expression. For people with intellectual disability, both of these rights are often infringed. It is important that our efforts to ensure people with disability are safe from experience of sexual violence do not restrict their rights to human relationships and sexual expression. The sexuality and sexual expression of people with intellectual disability are often viewed negatively by other people in their lives and society in general, in terms of risk, disapproval, fear, and as something to be controlled. Historically, negative views about sexuality of people with intellectual disability have resulted in practices such as forced sterilisation. Today, negative views underpin people's continued exclusion from sex and sexuality education. Research demonstrates people with intellectual disability have limited sexual knowledge in comparison to the general population, particularly in relation to sexually transmitted diseases, sexual health, safer sexual practices, legal issues, and contraception. Many people with intellectual disability do not receive any sex education. For those who do receive sex education, the information is not presented in ways people can understand, or it is presented as a one-off instruction rather than an ongoing discussion that is revisited and reinforced over time. Lack of knowledge and understanding of sex and sexuality increases people's risk of abuse and exploitation. Negative views about the sexuality of people with intellectual disability restrict their human rights to relationships and sexual expression. Research demonstrates that people with intellectual disability want to express their sexuality and have relationships, but experience a range of barriers in doing this. Lack of privacy for intimacy and sexual expression in residential settings can result in people using isolated public or semi-private spaces to be sexually active. Negative views and restrictions on sexual relationships can force people with an intellectual disability to conduct their sexual lives in secret, increasing the risk of abuse and exploitation. Sexual violence is any activity which a person does not or cannot consent. Sexual violence does not necessarily mean the person was physically injured during the assault. It is still a form of violence. Acts of sexual violence include rape or penetration, touching, forcing someone to touch, indecent exposure, harassment and sexual innuendo, forcing someone to look at pornography, and watching someone receive personal care, for example, washing or using the toilet for sexual gratification. Sexual violence is not about sex. It is about one person exercising power and control over another. People living with intellectual disability experience the same loss of power and control as all victims of sexual violence. These experiences occur in the context of and are compounded by broader systemic issues that remove personal choice and control from people with intellectual disability and create environments conducive to sexual violence. For example, inappropriate housing options and co-tenancy arrangements that force people to live together who may not otherwise choose to do so. The Criminal Code in Queensland defines consent to sexual activity as follows. Consent means consent freely and voluntarily given by a person with the cognitive capacity to give consent. A person's consent to an act is not freely or voluntarily given if it is obtained by force, or by threat or intimidation, or by fear of bodily harm, or by exercise of authority, or by false and fraudulent representations about the nature or purpose of the act, or by mistaken belief induced by the accused person that the accused person was the person's sexual partner. According to criminal law in Australia, the age of consent refers to the age a person is considered to be capable of legally giving informed consent to sexual acts with another person. When an adult engages in sexual behaviour with someone below the age of consent, they are committing a criminal offence or child sexual abuse. In Queensland, the age of consent for anal sex, referred to sodomy in the legislation, is 18 years of age, while the age of consent for all other sexual behaviour, described as carnal knowledge, is 16 years of age. There is no clear definition of cognitive capacity to consent to sexual activity in Queensland. However, the presence of cognitive impairment does not preclude a person from having capacity to consent. The Queensland Law Society Handbook for Practitioners on Legal Capacity outlines the following basic principles of law regarding capacity. All adult persons are presumed to have capacity to make all decisions unless there is evidence to rebut that presumption. Capacity is time-specific, domain-specific, and decision-specific, meaning at any given time a client may have capacity for some decisions but not others. The capacity to make a decision must be distinguished from the content of the decision itself, meaning bad decisions are not indicative of impaired capacity. Capacity should not be assessed solely on the basis of appearance, age, behaviour, including communication style, disability or impairment. Capacity may be increased with appropriate support, and substituted decision-making is a last resort. Capacity to consent should be considered a fluid concept. It can be influenced positively or negatively by the presence or absence of things such as information, support, threat, or coercion. Research demonstrates ongoing sex education and higher IQ increase potential for sexual consent capacity in people with intellectual disability. Whilst there is debate as to the nature and scope of knowledge required for a standard of informed consent, the following areas of knowledge are considered important to provide a framework for supporting people with intellectual disability to make informed decisions about sexual activity. Basic sexual knowledge of body parts, sexual relations, and sexual acts. Knowledge of the potential consequences of sexual relations, including sexually transmitted diseases and pregnancy. Understanding of appropriate sexual behaviour and the context for this. An understanding that sexual contact should always be a matter of choice. The ability to recognise potential abusive situations, and the ability to show skills of assertion and reject unwanted advances.
Thank you for completing Topic 1, What is Sexual Violence? Topic 2 will look at understanding the trauma effects of sexual violence. But first, please return to the home page to complete the learning activity.